Hello, welcome to our webinar on climate smart agriculture, brought to you by CFAIR, the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics. My name is Jane Kolodinsky, and I am the CFAIR Program Chair and Professor Emerita at the University of Vermont and Faculty Associate at Colorado State University. It is my pleasure to be moderating today's webinar. It is CFAIR's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of the profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agricultural and applied economics. Before we get started, I'd like to provide some background on today's topic. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is investing over $3.1 billion in 141 selected projects under the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. Commodities include crops, animal agriculture, and forest products. These products will reach 60,000 farms covering 25 million acres of working land. Over the life of the projects, 60 million metric tons of carbon will be sequestered. We will hear from the director of one of the funded centers at Virginia Tech, the Alliance to Advance Climate Smart Agriculture, as well as 3 researchers implementing climate smart agriculture in animal operations, realize soil improvements, and increase sustainability and farm viability through changes in production practices. Next slide. CFAIR has assembled a panel of experts to discuss their work, starting with Tom Thompson. Tom is an Associate Dean in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, CALS, at Virginia Tech, Director of CALS Global, and Professor of Agronomy. Thompson earned his BS, MS, and PhD degrees in agronomy and soil science and has served as professor and administrator at 3 U.S. universities. Next slide. Uma Karki is a research extension professor of animal science and state extension livestock specialist at Tuskegee University. One of the major focuses of Dr. Karki's current work is to promote the adoption of climate-smart agricultural practices such as agroforestry, sustainable year-round forage production and grazing management, and woodland grazing. Next slide. Rod M. Regezus is a professor and extension specialist in the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at North Carolina State University. Dr. Regezus has an active research and extension program that focuses on applied production economics with special emphasis on agricultural policies related to risk management and economic impact assessment of agricultural technologies. Next slide. Lawson Connor is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Agribusiness at the University of Arkansas with research and extension appointments in crop production economics. Lawson received his master's and PhD degrees from North Carolina State University. Next slide. Before we start, we wanted to explain how to ask questions during the webinar to make sure that you, the audience, knows how to engage. During the webinar, you can put questions to one or all of the speakers by typing it into the box in the control display accessed by clicking on the question drop-down as shown in this slide and sending it to the organizer. Now I'll hand the webinar over to Tom, who will start us off. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much, Jane. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to share some things with you about the Alliance to Advance Climate Smart Agriculture and to share the platform with our other panelists. Next slide, please. Let's start out with a definition of climate smart agriculture. There's a number of them that I could put up here. This one is from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and really focuses on, if you look at the end of this, the triple objectives of climate smart agriculture. First, sustainably increasing agricultural productivity and incomes. Second, adapting to climate change. And third, reducing greenhouse gas emissions where possible. Now, as an agronomist and soil scientist, I really have spent my career working on climate smart agriculture, although for most of my career, we've called that by other names, such as conservation agriculture or sustainable agriculture. These are not exclusive definitions. Next slide, please. So as Jane alluded to in the introduction, the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities is the USDA program that created our project, the Alliance to Advance Climate Smart Agriculture, as well as many others that are funded under this $3 billion program. This is a statement from the request for proposals that gives a little background on what USDA is looking for. Projects through this funding opportunity will build markets and invest in America's climate smart farmers, ranchers, and forest owners. USDA will support the production and marketing of climate smart commodities through these pilot projects, providing voluntary incentives, an important point, through partners to producers and landowners. Next slide. And so the Alliance to Advance Climate Smart Agriculture is one of these projects. We were fortunate to win $80 million of funding from the USDA, from this USDA program out of the $3 billion total. Ours is the 8th largest Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities project, and it's the largest grant award in Virginia Tech history. We will implement pilot projects in 4 states in selected soil and water conservation districts in Arkansas, Minnesota, North Dakota, and Virginia. Next slide. So let me give you a few of the high points of our program. There are many of these climate smart programs, and they all have unique features. Ours, again, has an $80 million budget, which will provide for direct payments to more than 4,000 farmers. And of our $80 million budget, $57 million of it will go in direct payments to farmers as incentives and rewards for adopting a set, or any one of a set of climate smart practices, which I'll put on the screen here in a moment. The budget will also go for project administration. We will lead the project here at Virginia Tech, but we'll have a number of partners, which I'll also show you in a moment. And we'll do research. So as a research institution, Virginia Tech, of course, is very interested in the outcomes. And so we want to understand what happens as a result of our incentive structure, how it affects adoption, how it affects profitability, productivity, and other important outcomes. So as I said, we'll implement pilot projects in these 4 states. And in these states, farmers will be eligible for a payment of $100 per acre or animal unit, and it's a maximum of 160 acres or animal unit per FSA farm number, and a maximum of 2 FSA farm numbers per individual. And what farmers need to do here is adopt 1 climate smart practice from the list that's been approved by USDA, and they get the payment. We'll split the payment into 3 tranches. All outdoor crops and livestock enterprises are eligible except for timber and aquaculture. We will provide technical support for implementation and record keeping, and we will be piloting a climate smart agriculture certificate that farmers can then market through various carbon marketing channels. Next slide. These are the eligible practices. If you're familiar with NRCS practice codes, that's exactly what you're looking at here. So in our application to the USDA, we propose these practices, crop practices, livestock practices, and then some practices that are specific to rice management. And Arkansas, of course, is our rice growing state within the Alliance. As I mentioned earlier, these are not new practices. Many of them have been around for decades. What's novel is not the practices themselves, but the incentives and rewards for producers to implement them. And all producers have to do is adopt 1 of these practices in order to be eligible. Next slide. We also have a research agenda. I won't go through this, but these are some of the key questions that our researchers, who will be agricultural economists, animal scientists, and crop scientists, this is what they will study and will, we think, inform that will really help us understand what happened in the project. Next slide, please. We have a long list of partners, and this list is growing almost every day. We have state leads, one in each state, who will actually implement the pilot on the ground. They will partner with soil and water conservation districts in their states. We have producer groups in each of the states, and we also have technical experts. And this list, this slide will grow here very soon. Next slide. As is required in the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities program, we will adhere to the administration's Justice 40 goals, which to me personally is one of the most exciting things about this project. And that is that 40% of our enrolled producers will be from underrepresented and historically underserved groups. And you can see some of them on this slide. And we will be engaging additional partners, which we call equity partners, in each of our states in order to help us reach these producers. There will also be minimum acreages in each state, which will vary a bit, but in Virginia, the minimum acreage for enrollment is only 2 acres, and I think the highest in our 4 states is 10 acres in Arkansas. So very small producers can be part of our program as well. Next slide. So that's a very quick overview within the time that I was given. I do invite you, if you're interested to know more. Of course, I hope I had the opportunity to answer some questions during the question time, but here is our information, and feel free to reach out to me personally or to visit our website for more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom, for your presentation. I just want to remind everyone to send questions to the organizer using the question drop-down menu. Now we'll be hearing from Dr. Uma Karki.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving an opportunity, the Shipyard Group, to share about our project this today. So I'll be sharing some of the highlights of the project that we have received. Next. I'd like to refresh the memory of our memory about the what the greenhouse gas effect and how this climate smart is becoming today's world, and why it is urgent. Dr. Thompson already presented some definition of the climate, and then this on the right hand side we see the thick layer of the atmosphere there that is blocking the exchange of heat between Earth and the atmosphere, while on the left hand side is the thin layer which is desirable. So all this climate smart project now the fund coming is for leaning towards the left hand side of the scenario. Let's next slide, please. So we have to be mindful of the agriculture is accounted for. These are the 3 major gases that we are targeting to minimize the emission of. 79% of carbon dioxide, 11.5% methane, and 6.2% nitrous oxide in the US. Next. So agriculture is accounted for contributing 10% if the machinery used in the operation is not accounted for, and 11% when all the machinery used in the operation is accounted for. So all the practices right here for agricultural and forestry climate smart practices is to reduce that contribution to the greenhouse gas. Next. So let me go and talk about some of the climate smart practices that we will be working on. Let's go. Next. So basically, in summary, what the farming, ranching, and forest practices, those reduces the greenhouse gas emission, such as the carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, sequester carbon, fix atmospheric nitrogen into the soil and plants, and add organic matter. Any of the practices we do, if they do any of these are basically the climate smart practices. Next. So some of the in pictures, some of the field or the plots over here. We can see the legume mix in the grass pasture, in the agronomic operation, use of cover crops in the use of legumes, and also the around forest production that we have been doing for such a long time. Some of those are already climate smart practices. Now the world we are focusing on to minimize those gas emissions and increase the carbon capture by doing the similar thing. Okay, so I just wanted to share with you some of the pictures. Let's next. Similarly, adding trees or shrubs into the production system or grazing system. Basically, if we do the leguminous shrubs and trees, that will also capture carbon, also keep the atmospheric nitrogen and make it available to soil and plants. So this is another practice we farmers can think of. Let's go to the next one. So this soil management is another huge area that we all need to be mindful of, not opening the soil, leaving it uncovered like that is shown in the left side of the picture over there. Rather, we can use the cover crops, add legumes into the production system or pasture, no-till drill when we need to plant or sow seeds, and then they use the mulch. When we produce some of the crops or vegetables, wherever applicable, just to conserve it, to minimize the escape of gases and capture more carbon into the soil. Let's next. So similarly, in the animal production system, avoid overgrazing, opening up all the soil like that in the left-hand side of the picture. Rather, it can be managed as shown in the picture on the right-hand side. So our focus will be the grazing management, pasture improvement. That can be some of the climate smart animal production system. Next. Silvopasture system is another system where trees and forages are grown in the single piece of unit of land, and then grazing animals are brought to utilize the unrestored vegetation. And that is how one can manage their land if there is an interest there. Next. So what are the opportunities for farmers under this climate smart project? Let's go next. So I'm involved in two projects. One is this expanding the participation of marginal producers and landowners to promote climate smart agriculture and forestry practices. That is as a result of continuous effort of 1890 Agroforestry Consortium. 3 states are involved in this, from Alabama, Tuskegee University and Alabama A&M University. From Virginia, Virginia State University, and from Maryland, University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. Let's go to the next. So there are major 2 components. One is livestock component, where the Tuskegee and Virginia State University are involved to work with the livestock producers. So the selected practices are silvopasture, rotational or prescribed grazing, and then pasture improvement, shrub establishment, and management. Next. Another aspect of the project is the alley cropping, including selected fruit trees, and then in the alleys growing the selected vegetables, berries, and herbs. So as you can see in the picture, the trees are grown in the row, leaving wide alleys in between the rows, and in the alleys crop are grown. That's basically the alley cropping portion of this project. Let's go to the next one. So virtual education information session for Alabama farmers has already begun from the beginning of this month, and now one session coming and one has to register here. And then here are the intent forms for farmers to participate for the livestock and for the alley cropping. Next. So another project I'm also part of is the next project. The Nature Conservancy is the lead, and multiple states and regions are involved. Tuskegee University is serving as the Southeast lead, and our role is to provide the education, training, and facilitating farmers for enrolling to the project. Next. So under this project, also the silvopasture, alley cropping, and windbreaks are the practices involved, and there is another portion in the project, that promotion of the commodities, marketing of those commodities produced from those practices. Next. So basically, that's all I have to share for now. I think I finished my time. Here is my email. And if we don't have time to speak, you can email me if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Karki. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Rod Jesus. Rod?
All right. Hear me okay? All right. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today and share some of our findings on a project on cover crops as a climate smart practice, essentially finding evidence of resilience effects of these cover crops. Next slide, please. So as most everybody know, agriculture is one of the most vulnerable sectors to climate change, given its nature. And there's a large and still growing literature that documents the negative impact of climate change on mean yields and also yield risk or yield variability. As such, agricultural practices that could enhance resilience of farm operations, specifically to climate change induced extreme weather events, are becoming very, very important. As Tom alluded to earlier, there's a lot of interest in supporting climate smart practices that allows farm operations to be more resilient and allow them to adapt to climate change. Next slide, please. And so planting cover crops is considered one such climate smart practice. In Tom's presentation, you saw cover crops as one of those practices in those lists that they will support. And it's considered a climate smart practice because it has potential to mitigate adverse effects of extreme weather events. So in that, I think Tom mentioned this tripartite objective of climate smart practice is to adapt. One of them is to adapt to climate change and improve productivity. And cover crops have been shown in previous studies that, yeah, it has potential to do that. And just as a brief sort of refresher, cover crops are those plants that are planted typically in the off period in the wintertime in the US for the purpose of protecting and improving soil health. So it's not typically intended for harvest. And there's a lot of policy interest recently to help encourage this practice because of this climate smart nature of the practice. And just by the fact that Tom got that $80 million grant and the $3 billion commitment from USDA, there is a lot of interest in promoting and helping encourage adoption of cover crops as a climate smart practice. But I argue that broader scientific evidence on the benefits and costs of cover crops in particular are still a little bit limited. There are lots of plot level experimental trial data in different locations across the US, but an analysis and evaluation of sort of actual on-farm outcomes of adoption of these kinds of practices in terms of climate change adaptation and mitigation, I argue has been a little bit limited. And of course, some of the projects that Tom is leading and the other projects funded by that Climate Smart initiative by USDA will hopefully help in terms of providing data-driven evidence on the benefits and costs of different climate smart practices. Next slide, please. And so this is just a picture of the typical sort of argument for why cover crops is considered a climate smart practice. On the left-hand side is the cover crops. It has green direction arrows that implies improvement in soil health. And at the bottom, there's a label there with climate resilience, helping mitigate extreme weather events due to the improvement of the soil health. So this is all well and good, but I guess the question then, and the focus of our study is, well, is there really evidence for a longer period of time and for a wider geographical scope that indeed these climate resilience effects are present when cover crop is adopted on farm operations? Next slide, please. And so the objective of this particular study that I'm sharing with you today is essentially to determine whether there is these resilience effects. And we leverage crop insurance losses, essentially, or crop insurance data to sort of tease out whether cover crops indeed help reduce crop insurance losses due to drought, excess heat, and excess moisture or floods. Okay? It's good that we have a crop insurance program in the US that collects data on these kinds of losses. And that is the data that I'm leveraging together with remote sensing data to answer that question of whether there is evidence that planting cover crops help enhance resilience of farm operations to extreme weather events. Next slide, please. And so to achieve that objective, the data we put together includes, as I said, crop insurance losses from RMA. That's weather specific. So we have that information, and merging it with remote sensing data on cover crop adoption and also weather data for a longer period from 2005 to 2018, and covering 645 counties over 12 states. Though the data is not at the farm level, it's at the county level, these outcomes are actually from aggregated, essentially farm level outcomes. So hopefully it broadens the evidence base in terms of potential resilience effects of cover crops and whether in fact there is evidence of that in actual farm operations. And we conducted several regression analysis and statistical analysis of this relationship. Next slide, please. And so the main punchline of this study is that, yes, we did indeed find evidence that counties, for example, with higher levels of cover crop adoption tend to have lower crop insurance losses due to drought, due to excess heat, and due to excess moisture. And although we find evidence of resilience to drought, heat, and moisture, our results indicate that for cover crops in particular, the resilience effects is stronger for moisture-related losses or floods. And this is consistent with sort of a lot of this anecdotal evidence, for example, in 2019 in the Midwest, where there was lots of flooding, there's lots of preventive planning, and there was anecdotal evidence, farmers arguing that, well, those that have fields with cover crop tend to have lower preventive planning claims, and we also show that in a separate study. And overall, based on our sort of calculations, we believe that the effect is economically meaningful. So if in 2018 there had been a 1 percentage point higher cover crop adoption, we believe based on our results that it would have reduced flood-related losses by $60 or so million. So it's a big amount. Next slide, please. In terms of, so these are data-driven evidence, I think, for cover crop resilience. Next slide, please. So in terms of policy implications, so again, going back to that tripartite objective that Tom mentioned, that climate smart practices need to show that they allow farmers to adapt to climate change. So our results, I think, help justify some of the support that's being given through NRCS like EQIP and CSP programs to support or encourage cover crop adoption. Next slide, please. Also, carbon markets could probably play a role in terms of encouraging further adoption of cover crops as a climate smart practice. A lot of people layer different cost share payments to help shoulder upfront costs, and that maybe is another sort of source of funding here. And so perhaps some thought on helping farmers get into carbon markets is a policy implication. Next slide, please. And the last thing I want to mention here is that our results support the idea behind the crop insurance premium discounts, the $5 flat discounts that have been offered in the past, and it supports this proposal by several senators, the Cover Act, to make that discount permanent. But it also, I believe, our results sort of paves the way for more discussion about, well, should we give more, not just a flat payment, but higher payment or a variable payment? And could soil health or conservation practices being incorporated in crop insurance rating? This is a little bit controversial. Some other folks think that crop insurance in itself is a barrier to adoption of cover crops, which I think this will, Dr. Connor will talk about this in the next presentation. But our results, I think, fosters more discussion or about this issue. Next slide, please. And as my last slide here, just if anybody's interested, these are the two papers that sort of I draw upon for this presentation. Thank you very much. Jane, back to you.
Thank you, Rod. An evidence base behind any policy decision is always important. Our next speaker is Dr. Lawson Connor. Welcome, Lawson.
Hi, good day. Hoping everyone can hear me. And today I'll be speaking a little bit about the policy interactions of on cover crops, on cover crop adoption. I will be speaking specifically about crop insurance and its effect on cover crop adoption. Next slide, please. And so Rod laid out pretty well some of the benefits that we've seen for cover crop adoption. And we've seen reduced losses on claims and increased crop resilience. Despite all of these, we still see that cover crop adoption has been quite low, at least nationally, and still quite lagged, even though we've seen some increases recently between 2012 and 2017, the last census, the last ag census. We've seen a 50% increase in adoption of cover crops. And a lot of this has been due to the policy work and funding that has gone into encouraging the practice. Next slide. And one of the things that we've also noticed is that there are strong local effects as well. In the Chesapeake Basin area, interaction of agriculture with the local aquaculture industries has encouraged a lot of local support for the practice to reduce impacts there, and we've seen increased adoption in those areas. But overall, the general story is that nationally, cover crop adoption remains quite low, generally in the 2 to 7% adoption rate on all crop acres. Next slide, please. And so some of the reasons for this, there are multiple reasons for this, and trying to understand all of the things that potentially influence cover crop adoption. There have been many studies that have been trying to look at this to understand these effects. Perhaps the biggest and most important driver is probably going to be profitability on the farm. If it's a profitable practice, then farmers will adopt. If not so much, then they will lag in adoption. Crop resilience has been another thing that has been investigated, as Rob just showed. Rather than looking at the upside, potentially we can be looking at whether cover crops reduce downside risks and prevent you from having those very bad years when they do arise. And of course, land features as well have also played a role. Proximity to nearby waterways, land slope, things like that have encouraged cover crop adoption. Overall, though, what we find is that, or what the current research has been showing, is that number one, on the profitability side, a lot of the profitability has been sort of mixed. And of course, one of the other issues is the lag in timing between when we see benefits and when we have adoption. And so that may encourage or discourage early adoption. And this is where policy has tried to play a role in encouraging adoption to reduce that barrier, especially early on in the adoption process of cover crops. And so we've seen many programs, federal programs, EQIP, CSP, state level programs, some of which have mimicked the national programs like the Maryland and the Vermont and New York programs. And also we've seen crop insurance discounts that have taken place in Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana as well. And so crop insurance has been sort of in the crosshairs for potentially playing a role in the adoption process as well. There are arguments for and against, and this is part of the reason that crop insurance premiums have been the subject of discounts recently. Risk protection seems to play potentially a role, and that's something we'll talk about today. And so the interaction of crop insurance with that risk protection, potentially the resilience effect that cover crops bestow, potentially introduces a link between the two. Next slide, please. And so on this slide, I'll probably work my way from bottom all the way up to the top and looking at how crop insurance and cover crops tend to relate. On the one hand, we could say that crop insurance and cover crops could be complementary in that crop insurance could potentially encourage cover crop adoption through reduced rates over time. And so you would think if it's making your crop insurance cheaper, then that could be something that encourages the use of that program, of cover crops. On the other hand, there are a lot of reasons that suspected that crop insurance could potentially work the other direction, where it discourages cover crop use. Program rules were a subject of debate prior to the 2018 Farm Bill, and those have been since updated. So that grayed out tends to suggest that those, we hope, are less of an issue today with how the rules, in terms of the when the policy attaches versus when planting actually happens. Those were some issues that were addressed in the 2018 Farm Bill. The classic moral hazard story of if I'm already covered, then I may reduce my incentive. It may reduce my incentives to protect my yields. Otherwise, since I know I have that guarantee coming in, so that plays a role as well in the discussion. But of course, the speed of the updates of premium rates are also one of the things that could potentially play a role, and that would introduce what we tend to call redundant risk protection, where if your rates don't reflect the benefits that cover crops are bestowing on your farm, then you may think that you're kind of redundantly covering. Crop insurance is federally backed, and so those guarantees or those payments are guaranteed, and so that may affect your incentive to adopt cover crops as a result. And so the speed of those premium rates is something that could potentially be looked at in the future. Next slide. And so the objective of this study, we won't be focusing on any specific piece of the crop insurance program. We'll be trying to look at it overall. And so we'll be trying to determine, or we've tried to determine whether crop insurance in general, participation in that program affects cover crop adoption at all. And so we use the OPTIS satellite detected data, which is the county level aggregate of cover crops. And in this case, we focused on Indiana. And we use the policy IVs. The subsidy rates have been changed over time, and we use that as an IV, instrumental variables analysis, to determine the effect that that program has on cover crop adoption. Next slide. And our results suggest that for a 1 percentage point increase in participation or increase in liabilities covered by crop insurance, that decreases adoption of cover crops by 0.5%. And what that translates to more recently is about 50,000 acres in a state similar to Illinois, where we had 140 million total crop acres and 7.2% adoption in 2021. What this suggests is that we do see a relationship between crop insurance and the adoption of cover crops, although it's subject to interpretation, whether that is small on an economic scale or large. Next slide, please. Regardless of the size, what it does mean is that it potentially decreases the efficiency of dollars spent on other incentive programs. So it means that we have to spend more on those programs in order to increase adoption, especially where crop insurance use is high in those areas. The RMA and NRCS and FSA have agreed on rules, and as I said in 2018, have passed some rules that we think helped to mitigate this potential effect. But of course, it also still suggests that perhaps the rating methods need to be could be investigated even further to determine whether there are ways that we can incorporate those benefits that cover crops have on resilience more speedily into the rating system. So similar questions exist for the Title I programs, although those are the subject of future research. Next slide. And so if you have any additional questions, or if you want to seek more information, this is the paper that I'm referencing for the results in the APP. Thank you.